we have a real opportunity. If you think about the work that the Capitol Historical Society does, we are now over 60. We were started in 1962 by a member of Congress named Fred Schwengel, who was determined that not only White House history would be told, but congressional history and the history of the Capitol. We are chartered by Congress in order to tell the story of the Capitol and the people who work in it in a manner that inspires informed patriotism. We're supported by our members and friends. Thank you very much for your kindness and your generosity. And that's what allows us to bring authors like Burt Griffin to you in this format and many others. Today, we're going to be joined by the person I know as Judge Burt Griffin, but he's going to talk about a time in his life that was first, even before he was ever a judge. He was a Warren Commission lawyer as a young attorney, worked on the investigation of the John F. Kennedy assassination and in the 60th anniversary of that assassination, Judge Griffin has written a new book called JFK, Oswald, and Ruby, Politics, Prejudice, and Truth. And in this book, Judge Griffin, our former Warren Commission lawyer, renews again the Kennedy assassination, its many, many investigations, the effect on the Cold War and the Civil Rights Movement. What motives did Lee Harvey Oswald and Jack Ruby have? Judge Griffin will talk to you from his own initial skeptical reactions to the assassination, what he learned about the Dallas police investigation, and what he has learned not just when he was working for the commission, but over the years as he continued his passion to understand what happened. After nearly 6 decades of study, Judge Griffin is satisfied that Oswald acted alone. He concludes that violence in the Cold War and the Civil Rights Movement caused Oswald to believe that the blame for Kennedy's death might be placed on the followers of right-wing activist and former U.S. Army General Edwin Walker. Walker was an outspoken enemy of Oswald's idol, Cuban President Fidel Castro, and a firm opponent of racial integration. And Oswald had already attempted to murder Walker in April of 1963. The author gives the Walker movement a more prominent place in the assassination story and traces the conflicting interests of the various parties, particularly Walker, Oswald, Kennedy, and Ruby, as they all collided in October and November of 1963. This book gives serious scholars and readers an opportunity to separate truth from fiction and to become examiners of how insignificant, unsuspected, powerless people, driven by very personal needs and fears, can, with the help of a firearm, alter the course of history. I told you a little bit about Burt Griffin. Yes, he was the assistant counsel to the President's Commission on the assassination of President Kennedy. He grew up to be a distinguished judge in Cleveland, Ohio, and is with us today as a distinguished scholar. So it is now my honor to present to you Judge Griffin. This is the time.
Jane, I'm not sure that I'm on.
Your voice is on. We need your Sam. Can you help him turn on his? There we are. We can see you. Great.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I feel like I don't have to say anything. You've done a wonderful job, Jane, of describing the book. And I'm going to shoot a question back to you. It's somewhat age related. Do you remember where you were and what your reaction was when you first heard that President Kennedy had been shot?
I do. I remember it very clearly. I was in the 5th grade at Malvern Elementary School, and out of our window, we saw the flag, and we saw the flag go down to half staff. Now, the teacher didn't tell us what was going on, but we had learned what it meant, that if the flag was at half mast, that something terrible had happened. And we all walked to school. And that day, at the end of school, when we walked out of school, there were so many mothers in their cars. And that's how we learned, as the moms said, we came to pick up our kids because the president has been assassinated.
Well, Jane, I'm sure that so many of our audience will have memories of their own. And it's almost a way in which you can tell someone's age. I had the opportunity to speak to a group of college students, 18, 19, 20-year-old students a few months ago. And when I asked them whether they had read anything about the assassination of President Kennedy, their answer was no. And when I asked them when they had seen the movie JFK, their answer was no. So that's ancient history for people who were not alive and present at the time of the assassination. But for those, I think of many of us in our audience, it's a day that we will never forget. It's certainly a day that I will never forget. I was returning from my lunch hour. I was a young lawyer in Cleveland, Ohio, and I had previously been an assistant U.S. attorney prosecuting criminal cases. But I was in private practice of the law. I was 31 years old. And as I got onto our office elevator in coming back from lunch, someone said the president had been shot. And my immediate reaction was those damn segregationists, because this was a time when repeated violence in the months before the assassination. Medgar Evers had been murdered in June of 1963. There was a bombing in Birmingham, Alabama in September of 1963 at the 16th Street Ebenezer Baptist Church, and 4 girls, teenage girls, were killed. Others were injured, and people were worried about the safety of President Kennedy and any visit that he was going to take to Texas and the South. So my reaction was those damn segregationists. But then very quickly, Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested. Within approximately an hour of the shooting of President Kennedy, he was arrested. And when I learned, and it came out very quickly, that he had been a defector to the Soviet Union and had lived in the Soviet Union for a period of time, I thought, I don't trust these investigators. Maybe it's J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI trying to arrest somebody that was their suspect because the Hoover organization at that time was pursuing potential and admitted Marxists in a very aggressive way. But as the evidence developed, and you must understand that in 1963, the assassination of President Kennedy was not a federal crime. It depended upon where the crime had been committed. And this particular crime was committed not on federal property, but on the streets of Dallas. And so this was a matter for the Dallas Police Department to investigate. I didn't know anything about the Dallas Police Department, but the evidence began to come in very, very quickly, so that by the time the night wore on, by midnight of November 22nd, Oswald was indicted not simply for one murder, but for 2, because he had murdered a Dallas police officer very shortly after he was alleged to have shot President Kennedy. So what did we know, and what did the Dallas Police Department have in the way of evidence that caused them to indict Lee Harvey Oswald? Would you move to the next slide, please? This is the slide of where this occurred. This is Dealey Plaza, and you can, if you look closely at it, you can see the numbers on the buildings. And number one is the Dallas, Texas School Book Depository, and that is the place. And you can see Elm Street there, and the president's motorcade was proceeding along Elm Street. Can we go to the next slide, please? This is a close-up view of the Texas School Book Depository. And in the 6th floor window, you'll see item A, which is where the witness who, and this is a reenactment of it, but Howard Brennan was standing in Dealey Plaza. You can see Howard Brennan at the very bottom of the screen. And when shots were fired, he looked up and saw a gunman at point A. And then he heard another shot fired. There were three employees in the open window immediately below the place from which the shots were observed to be fired. In fact, the sound of the shooting was of such a nature that it caused the ceiling to somewhat come down. The classroom, the ceiling came down and actually struck one of the witnesses on the head. So very quickly, a few of the people who were police officers became aware, as a result partly of Howard Brennan's telling them that he saw the shooter. And incidentally, I will say there was a second witness to the shooting, a man named Amos Ewens, a young man, 14-year-old, probably cutting school at the time. So both Howard Brennan and Amos Ewens saw shots being fired from point A on this photograph. And they went to nearby police officers, and police officer Howard Baker then went into the building and got the building superintendent. And if we can go to the next slide, please. They went into the building, and actually by this time a number of officers had come into the building, went to the 6th floor, and what was seen on the 6th floor was a set of boxes that were set up in the window. You can see the circles on the boxes, in the nature of a parapet from which rifle shots could be fired. Then also what they saw when they got onto the 6th floor of the building were a set of cartridges. Can you go to the next slide, please? Okay, on the floor, right next to the boxes, were 3 cartridges, empty cartridges from a weapon of some sort. And then after a little bit more searching, officers found a rifle on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. Can we go to the photograph of the rifle? If you look closely at this photograph, you can see a rifle squeezed in between a set of boxes. This was approximately 3 feet from the stairway going down to the lower floors. So we had a rifle, a Mannlicher Persano rifle. We had, and I should not say we, the Dallas police had a rifle, They had cartridges and they had fingerprints, which they were able to take both from the rifle and from the boxes that had been set up in the window. Now, so the question then was, where was the shooter and who was the shooter? One of the officers who entered the building was H.M. Baker, who had been the very last motorcyclist in the motorcade procession in which the president was shot. He dropped his motorcycle at the entrance to the school book depository, went into the building, found the superintendent, Roy Truly, and Truly and Baker began to go upstairs. By this time, they were aware that the shots had been fired from the 6th floor window. When they got into the lunchroom of the 2nd floor, Officer Baker saw Lee Harvey Oswald. He had nothing in his hands, and Baker was about to arrest him. But Roy Truly, who was the superintendent of the Texas School Book Depository, said that there was no need to arrest Oswald, that he was an employee of the School Book Depository. So Baker and Roy Truly then proceeded upstairs from the 2nd floor to the 6th floor. Meanwhile, however, Oswald went to a Coke machine, got a soft drink out of the machine, I presume Coca-Cola in those days, and began to walk through the office of a secretary on his way to a doorway which led to an exit to the building. When the secretary, and he was holding in his hand a Coca-Cola can or a soft drink can, which had not been observed by Baker or Truly. So in any event, Oswald proceeded out of the building, walked about 7 blocks to a bus stop, hailed a bus which had been stopped in traffic. It was not the normal stopping point for this bus. Got onto the bus, and coincidentally, seated in the bus as a passenger was an older woman who had been his landlady. And she recognized him immediately. The bus proceeded on for a few blocks, but got stuck again in traffic. At that point, Oswald asked, and this all comes from witnesses in Dallas, Texas. At this point, the bus driver said that he gave Oswald a bus transfer. Oswald got out of the bus, walked another couple of blocks to a Greyhound bus station, and hailed a cab. Had the cab drive to a particular address in the 5100 block of the street that he was going to, which was enabled him to go past his rooming house. Oswald was 24 years old. He was married but not living with his wife. His wife lived in a nearby suburb of Irving, Texas. And in any event, Oswald was living alone in a rooming house that had, of all things, more than 20 different roomers. Oswald had the cab driver drive beyond the rooming house. He got out of the rooming house a couple of blocks beyond the rooming house, then walked back to the rooming house, went into the rooming house, and incidentally, at that time, this is November 22nd, he was not wearing a jacket. He had a jacket which he had worn to work that morning at the Texas School Book Depository. He left his jacket at the School Book Depository. But when he got back to his rooming house, he got another jacket that he was able to put on. He secured a pistol and at least 15 rounds of ammunition. He then very quickly left the rooming house and stood for a few minutes at a bus stop, but then began to walk in the residential neighborhood. Meanwhile, Howard Brennan, who had been the witness who first saw Oswald shooting from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository, had given a description of the man that he saw as a shooter. And the description reasonably met the appearance of Oswald. It was, although not close, Oswald was 24 years old. He thought the shooter might be 30. Said he was about 165 pounds and perhaps 5'10", and a white male. In any event, presumably because the police officer thought he met the person he was seeing, who was Oswald, met the description that had been given over police radio, stopped his car in the residential neighborhood and got out of the car and hailed Oswald to the car. When the officer, whose name was J.D. Tippett, got around to the front of the car, Oswald pulled out his pistol, fired 3 shots. Officer Tippett fell to the ground. Oswald then went to a prostrate body and fired another shot in his head. At that, and incidentally, there were 2 witnesses also at this particular time. One of whom saw the shooting itself. The other one heard the shots and saw Oswald fleeing. Oswald then fled, and very quickly the witnesses to the J.D. Tippett shooting, and incidentally, President Kennedy was shot at approximately 12:30 p.m. And this particular shooting of J.D. Tippett occurred approximately a half hour after the shooting of President Kennedy. In any event, Oswald then fled from the Tippett shooting, was seen running away, and he was next seen at the lobby entrance to a shoe store on a commercial street. I believe the street was Houston Street, but I'm not certain of that. In any event, there were, by the time he got to the shoe store, there were police sirens because the witnesses to the Tippett shooting had been able to grab the radio microphone of Tippett's police car and told the dispatcher what had happened. So police cars were en route with sirens blazing to the scene of the Tippett shooting. Oswald stood in the lobby of the entranceway to the shoe store, did not go into the store, the outside lobby, with his back to the street and facing in through the window. The store manager saw him and thought this was extremely suspicious and thought that he had a kind of harried and frightened look on his face. But as soon as the siren stopped, Oswald turned around, did not go into the store, but the store manager then followed him and saw him go in to the Texas Theater, which was 2 or 3 storefronts away from the shoe store. The Oswald went in, did not pay. The cashier herself, cashier for the theater herself, had heard the sounds of the sirens and had gone out to the street to see what was happening. Oswald passed by her, went into the theater without paying, and so the store manager, the shoe store manager, told the cashier to call the police. And the long and the short of that is that police quickly came to the Texas School Book Depository. Lights were turned on. The store manager pointed out the person that he had been at the store, who turned out to be Lee Oswald, and a police officer went to approach Oswald. And when he got up to Oswald, Oswald pulled out his pistol and tried to shoot the police officer. But the police officers placed his hand on the muzzle of the gun, prevented the gun from firing, and Oswald was arrested. So that's the long and short of the story of what the Dallas Police Department had at the time that Oswald was arrested. Jane, are you still with me? Well,
I certainly am. I certainly am. I'm
going
just
to ask you another question.
okay, boss.
If you were on the jury and that was the evidence that you had, what would you think about that evidence with respect to Lee Harvey Oswald?
Well, it would appear that he was the shooter, but I think the question that people always have is, was he really on his own? That, that seems to be the enduring question.
And we're going to get to that.
What do you know about that?
We're going to get to that in just a few minutes. But I want to make it just as clear as possible that it seems to me, as Chief Justice Warren said to us in the early stages of our investigation, and when he was aware of this evidence, and the Chief Justice had been a prosecutor, almost like Kamala Harris. He'd been a prosecutor, I believe, in San Francisco. And he was a very respected prosecutor who was actually voted by his colleagues as the number one prosecutor in the United States. In any event, when Warren became aware of this evidence, his statement to some of us was that if he had been the prosecutor in that case, he would have convicted Oswald in 3 days. So I think at least you're in league, Jane, with Chief Justice Warren, and I happen to agree with you that I think the evidence, without any other ballistics or scientific evidence, the evidence seems to me to be rather overwhelming, demanding that Oswald was the shooter. But why did he do it? And that's the question that people have been struggling with for the last, and we struggled with for the last 60 years. We didn't get an answer to that, although we collected a lot of evidence. And one of the reasons we didn't get an answer to it was that after 2 days of being questioned at the Dallas Police Department, he was shot by Jack Ruby. Can we have the next slide here? Okay, this is the slide of his route from 1233, when he was about the time that the Warren Commission estimated that he left the school book depository until he wound up being ultimately arrested in the Texas theater. So it was a little over an hour after the shooting, and he was arrested. Can we go to the next slide? Okay, here is Jack Ruby. And I'm sure that many of you have seen this photograph. This is Jack Ruby shooting Lee Harvey Oswald in the basement of the Dallas police station. Oswald was in the process of being transferred to the custody of the Dallas County Sheriff, which was in another building. And this is Jack Ruby with the gun pointed right at Oswald's stomach, and Oswald was shot in the stomach and died by the time he got to Parkland Hospital, which is the same hospital that President Kennedy was taken to. So who was this guy, Jack Ruby? Because I think that's part of the conspiracy question, and my responsibility as a staff person for the Warren Commission was to attempt to determine what Jack Ruby's motive was. There's no question that Jack Ruby shot him. There's just incredible Pulitzer Prize winning photograph here of the shooting. But why did he do it? When Ruby was wrestled to the ground, to the floor of the basement of the school book depository, excuse me, not school book depository, Texas police station, and was taken up to the upper floor to await questioning. Secret Service, the first person to question him was a Secret Service agent, Horace Sorrells. And Sorrells asked the question of Ruby, Jack, why did you do it? And Ruby's answer was, I had to show the world a Jew had guts. Ruby's name was an adopted name. He had been born Jacob Rubenstein in Chicago, Illinois. He was in his early 50s at this point, never married, but ran a striptease nightclub. Can we go to the next slide, please? Here is a full-page advertisement that attracted Ruby's attention on the morning that President Kennedy was shot. Kennedy, or excuse me, Ruby was at the offices of the Dallas Morning News at about 11 o'clock in the morning before the president was shot at 12:30 in the afternoon. And Ruby was placing an ad for one of his two striptease nightclubs. But he had seen this full-page black bordered ad in the Dallas Morning News and was very upset about it. The photograph here is not blown up enough, but the photograph was signed with the American Fact-Finding Committee, Bernard Weissman, chairman. The American Fact-Finding Committee was actually a committee that consisted of 4 people who were John Burt Society members who had contributed a good bit of money in those days, about $1,400, to place this full-page ad in the Dallas Morning News. And although the ad says, "Welcome, Mr. Kennedy, to Dallas," the rest of the ad is not a welcoming ad in any respect. It is a criticism of President Kennedy's foreign policy, particularly his what the American Fact-Finding Committee and the John Burt Society at the time thought was a Marxist pro-communist sympathy on the part of Mr. Kennedy. And when Ruby saw that the reported chairman of the American Fact-Finding Committee was Bernard Weissman, and he recognized it as a Jewish name, he thought that no one who was Jewish could possibly be anti-Kennedy, and that this was some way that the black border on the ad signified the intended assassination of President Kennedy. It was like a death symbol. And so Jack Ruby then became the first conspiracy investigator. He was determined to try to find Bernard Weissman. And Ruby was a very thorough investigator. He looked in the telephone directory and couldn't find he didn't know it, Bernard Weissman in Dallas. He looked in the telephone directory and couldn't find Weissman's name in the telephone directory. And then he, in the course of his investigation, talked to the man who had been his lawyer, and his lawyer didn't know anybody named Bernard Weissman either. but suggested that he look for a street directory. So Ruby tried to get his hands on a street directory and could not find the name Bernard Weissman in his street directory. So he was convinced that Bernard Weissman was a fictitious name, and that this ad was in some way connected with the assassination, and that Jews would be blamed for the assassination of President Kennedy. In fact, he had some reason to believe this, and we'll get to this later, because in April, as Jane said, in April 1963, after Oswald had tried to murder retired General Edwin Walker, there was a wave of anti-Semitic violence in Dallas in the 2 weeks after the assassination, in which the homes and stores of Jewish merchants, including Stanley Marcus of the famed Neiman Marcus department stores, were vandalized, accusing whoever had attempted to shoot, and it was not known who attempted to shoot Walker at the time, but alleging that this was some kind of a Jewish group that had tried to assassinate Walker. So, in any event, in Ruby's mind, he was connecting the shooting at Walker with this ad and with the idea that this was a fictitious, completely fictitious name that was placed on the advertisement. So Ruby set out to locate the Bernard Weissman, and also tried to follow the investigation that was being publicized of the investigation of President Kennedy's assassination. He went to temple services that Friday night. The president was shot on Friday, November 22nd, and Ruby went to temple services on Friday night. And when services ended, he went to a delicatessen, bought 6 corned beef sandwiches and 6 soft drinks with the intention of bringing them to the Dallas police station and ingratiate himself with the police, which he did. And can we have the next slide, please? Incidentally, this was found in, he closed his nightclubs with this handmade sign before going to temple. And then can we have the next slide? And when Oswald was introduced about midnight, November 22nd, to the press, there was a press conference. And you can see Jack Ruby in the back row. Here's a photograph of Jack Ruby at the press conference. He's got the dark tie and the dark jacket. And if you look closely at his hands, he's holding a piece of paper in his left hand, and in his right hand, it looks like he's holding a pen or a pencil. In fact, he was posing as he knew a lot of police officers, and he was able to get in with his corned beef sandwiches and so forth to the Dallas police station, although they turned him down because they said they'd already eaten. But he said he was there as a translator for the Israeli press. And so here's a picture of Ruby at the point when Oswald is being displayed by the county prosecutor, Henry Wade, who incidentally is the Wade of Roe v. Wade. When Oswald was being displayed by Henry Wade to the press. So this was part of Ruby's own personal investigation. Ultimately, he got up one Sunday morning, and he was very upset. He was he was convinced that Oswald was guilty, that Oswald was the man, and it had been announced that if he got the it had been announced to the press that if the press arrived by 10 o'clock on Sunday morning, they would be in time to see Oswald being transported from the Dallas police station to the county jail. Ruby, in the meantime, had received a telephone call from one of his strippers who hadn't been paid because she hadn't worked and needed money. Her name was professionally known as Little Lynn, and Little Lynn said she needed money to pay her rent and to buy food. So Ruby said that he was going downtown and that he would wire her a money order from the Western Union office. The Western Union office was 1 block from where Oswald was being held at the Dallas police station. So Ruby got in his car. It was after 10 o'clock in the morning. Brought his favorite dog with him. Ruby, incidentally, was a dog lover and owned 7 dogs, one of whom he called his wife. And he brought his wife's dog, Sheba, put her in the car, drove down to the parking lot across the street from the Western Union office, left the dog in the car, saw a crowd gathered outside of the Dallas police station, which he realized that Oswald had not been moved, but nonetheless stood in line waiting to send a $25 money order to Little Lynn. And we know that the time that the money order was sent was approximately 4 minutes before before Ruby was able to leave the Western Union office, walk to the police station, walk down an unprotected ramp and see the photograph and do the shooting which you saw in the photograph. So it's pretty clear that, at least it was to me, that Ruby was unlikely to have had any associates, unless perhaps he had an associate in the Dallas Police Department. And that became a primary focus of our investigation. In any event, Ruby was ultimately, at his own request, Ruby ultimately testified before the Warren Commission. He denied that he had any associates. He admitted to all of his concern about anti-Semitism and feeling that Jews would be blamed for the assassination. And I don't have any question that, from Ruby's standpoint, he hoped, as he said, that by his own sense of being Jewish, that he would disabuse anybody of the idea that Jews had been involved in the assassination of President Kennedy. Okay, so where do we go from here to the assassination of President Kennedy? It's a much more complicated question. I'm realizing, looking at my watch, Jane, that I'm going to have to take through this very, very quickly, and may not be able to get to the end of it before people are able to answer questions. But the bottom line of this is that that Oswald, when he returned to the United States, having defected to the Soviet Union, followed very closely the news events. And he was an avowed Marxist, and he subscribed to the newspaper, the U.S. Communist Party, the Worker, and the Worker had written an editorial about General Walker, whose picture you here see here, saying that Walker was a potential Hitler, and that came about because Walker had attempted to stop the integration in 1962, the integration of the University of Mississippi by James Meredith. Can we show the Meredith photograph here? This is September of 1962, and this is James Meredith being accompanied by I think actually by police officers. I'm not entirely sure of this, but anyhow, this is Meredith being accompanied to register at the University of Mississippi in September of 1962. Walker appeared at a rally on the campus of this particular day, on the campus of Ole Miss, and in which there were thousands of people gathered to try to prevent Meredith from enrolling at Ole Miss. A riot ensued. 3 people were killed. 100, this may sound familiar to you, 100 police officers were physically injured. Actually, National Guardsmen were physically injured, but Walker, Meredith was admitted and was the first African American in the country to be admitted to a segregated college in the South. So Walker was indicted for the riot that he had kind of organized, at least had been the prime speaker at, was arrested, returned to Dallas with to a large crowd once he made bond, with people carrying banners urging him to run for president. So Edwin Walker was a prime political figure in the United States at that time. Meanwhile, Oswald was living with his wife and his one child. When a Mississippi grand jury in January of 1963 declined to indict Walker, Oswald bought the rifle, which you see here, which is the rifle that he used to shoot President Kennedy, had his wife take a picture of himself holding the rifle. A gun is in a holster, a pistol in a holster on his right hip, and he's holding a copy of 2 left-wing newspapers, one the Militant and the other the Worker. He actually sent this photograph to the publisher of the Militant, which was the Socialist Workers' Party of the United States. In any event, Oswald set out to shoot Walker and missed. His wife then persuaded him to leave Dallas, and I think we can go to the next photograph. They then moved to New Orleans in late May and early June of 1963, and here is Oswald passing out pro-Cuba, pro-Castro literature, because what he was trying to do was create a dossier for himself to go to Cuba and to live in Cuba as he had lived in the Soviet Union. And can we have the next photograph? Meanwhile, before Oswald got to Cuba, and in fact, he never did get to Cuba, before Oswald was on his way attempting to go to Cuba, Castro was interviewed, I believe this was in Brazil, in which he accused and this is published in the New Orleans Times Picayune, which we assume that Oswald read. He also listened to Dallas radio, so he could have heard what Castro was claiming. And Castro claimed, and rightly so, that the CIA was attempting to assassinate him and other Cuban leaders, and that if they succeeded in doing that, they would be retaliated against. So all of this was on Oswald's mind as he built his dossier to try to get admission to Cuba. We'll move on to the next photograph then. But when he got to Mexico City, and in an attempt to present his credentials to the Cuban embassy, they turned him down initially. So he came back to Dallas. By this time, his wife had moved back to Dallas. He came back to Dallas and had been rejected in Cuba. And the essence of his life was that his life was falling apart. And here, this is a photograph of myself in Oswald's room, the room that Oswald was living in on the day that he shot President Kennedy. He was separated from his wife. His wife had declined to take telephone calls from him. His own life had collapsed. Meanwhile, however, the people in Dallas thought that the primary threat to President Kennedy were the supporters of General Walker. So my own view, and I'm sorry to shorten this so much, but my own view is that the probabilities are great that Oswald thought that if Kennedy were shot, that the Walker people would be blamed, and that the result would be that he would, the Walker movement would be really put to an end, and that Castro would be saved. We're almost at 1 o'clock. Do we want to take?
Absolutely. Well, first, let me just say, Judge, thank you so much for taking this time to share your experience and to share, such helpful context. I know one of the reasons, and we are getting questions, so if you're up for a little bit of overtime, for those who are able to stick around, we'll get into some of the questions. I know a lot of folks have questions about the Warren Commission investigation itself, but if I may, I think a reason that this is such a timely and important topic is that, we're in a moment where we've seen two recent attempts at an assassination just this summer. And there have been around a dozen serious attempts on presidents or presidential candidates since John F. Kennedy. Do you have any thoughts you'd like to share on, what, based on your experience investigating the Kennedy assassination, what we can learn about society broadly, or about these sorts of episodes to better process them as the American people?
Well, I think if we can focus on who the shooters were on Kennedy, on Ruby and Oswald, and understand who they were and how their lives were going, we're going to see two basically insecure people who wanted to do something heroic. I think Oswald wanted to get away with it. It was very clear that he his hope that even if he was caught, that he would claim that he was being falsely accused. And you know what they were is brought on by the spirit of the time, by the anger of the times. And Ruby clearly was motivated by the anger of the times and his fear, that lifelong fear of anti-Semitism. But if we understand Oswald and know how his life was shaped from his childhood, we have a lot of information about his childhood through his marriage, through his defection to the Soviet Union, for his dissatisfaction with the Soviet Union. We can see Oswald as a person whose life had collapsed. And I think it was purely coincidental that the president should be coming to Dallas at a time when his own life was collapsing.
Sure. And then one other quick one before we do what Jane always calls our NPR moment. It's a quick question. I don't know that as a quick answer, but why do you think the Kennedy assassination in particular has spawned so many conspiracy theories in the 60 years since its tragic occurrence? What do you think about this episode?
Well, I think there are a couple of reasons. One is that we haven't come up with an answer, and there hasn't been a lot of interest in what the motive was of Oswald shooting Kennedy. But the other part of it is that both the CIA and the FBI concealed important evidence from the Warren Commission, and so they have come to be distrusted in a way that they had not previously been distrusted. Excuse me.
I think that's a succinct answer there, Judge, and I appreciate it. Let me take a brief moment to once again thank everyone. We are going to stay on the line for some additional Q&A here, but before everyone starts to duck out, as Jane mentioned at the top, we are ever grateful to the members and supporters of the Capitol Historical Society. We do not receive routine government funding, and so your support of our organization is what enables us to put on this kind of programming and pursue our civic education work and everything else we are so proud to do. We have some exciting upcoming programs that Vincent will queue up here so you can take a look ahead. We've got some great scholars coming through. We've got H.W. Brands will be discussing his new book, Founding Partisans, about that first generation of nasty political politics. We've got a talk with an old friend of the society, Kurt Dion, who wrote a book about his journeys as a child to visit every presidential grave. We've got Harold Holzer speaking about his new book on Lincoln and immigration. We've got our old friend Robert Watson as well coming back to town at the end of October to discuss an upcoming book about the mad dash to save Washington, D.C. at the end of the Civil War. All of these programs are available live, and they're also recorded and posted to our YouTube channel. If you'd like to take a second and scan that QR code while Vincent has it up there, you can do so to register for these programs and keep in touch with us at the Society. So again, I'll just say thank you. And now let's shift in to some bonus time, some extra innings, some overtime, depending on your favorite sport of choice out there in the world. There are a lot of technical questions, and if you're up for knocking out a few of these, Judge, I'll pose through some of them. One correspondent here asks how your colleague on the committee staff, Arlen Specter, who would go on to serve in Congress, how he came up with the single bullet theory.
Okay, let me say that it wasn't Arlen that came up with the theory. It was actually Roy Humes, who was one of the autopsy surgeons, who came up with a theory, because what had happened was that there was an entrance wound in the back of the president's neck, and no apparent exit wound at that point. However, X-rays of the body showed no bullets in the president's body. Dr. Humes called the Parkland Hospital doctors and learned that a tracheotomy that had been performed at Parkland Hospital to try to save the president's life had been performed in the front of his neck, and that the place that it had been performed at, there was what appeared to be an entrance wound, but they had not, the Parkland doctors had not turned the body over to know that there was another entrance wound in the back. So the Parkland and the Bethesda doctors reached an agreement that what had happened was that the president had been shot in the back of the neck, that it had gone all the way through his neck, exited at the point where the tracheotomy was performed, and interestingly enough, the fibers on the president's necktie and his shirt were pushed forward, which would indicate the direction that the bullet was going. So then the question was, where did the bullet go? And there were no bullets in the car. The only thing that was in front of the president was Governor Connally. So I think, yes, Specter and others of us on the staff, and I was aware of what that Specter's discussion was, but I wasn't the direct participant in it. But Specter, Norman Redlick, Mel Eisenberg, and Dave Bellin, all four of them were very much involved in this and came to the conclusion that the Parkland Hospital or the Bethesda autopsy surgeons and the Parkland Hospital doctors were correct. So it wasn't Arlen Specter. You can't.
Sure.
He was a candidate for president at one point, and he would have liked to have had credit for this, but he doesn't really get all the credit.
More than fair. It always takes a team on any significant project, whether it's a group project we've all been part of in our academic lives, or whether it's something as weighty and significant as a major national investigation. There's another. Let me see here. There's a number of questions about the timing of Oswald's movements on the day of the assassination. Do you think, I know as you were getting into the timeline that's been established, but maybe, to help some of the folks on the call, could you, just recap briefly how we're confident in that timeline of, when he fired the shot and his movements until he was eventually captured? I know you talked about some of the witnesses, but maybe just a quick recap.
Dave Bellin, who was not much of who was one of my colleagues, who was not much of an athlete, was able to figure out how quickly he could get from the 6th floor window down into the room where he was seen, where Oswald was seen in the lunchroom. So, and Bellin really worked on this problem, and Bellin came to the conclusion, as the film later showed, that Oswald left the building at about 12:33, and then we know what time he arrived at the Dallas police station after having been arrested. So, it was about an hour and 17 minutes from the time he would have left the police, left the 6th floor window, or rather left the school book depository. And we also know what time we know what time a bus transfer was given to him. That was stamped on. So we know what time he was on the bus. The other times are we know what time the phone call was made from the police radio. So yes, it's a pretty amazing for the year 1963. It's a pretty amazing set of documentation.
Sure, absolutely. Absolutely. And you mentioned in your presentation, something that caught my ear was that at the time, presidential assassination was not yet a federal crime. I know this is slightly, it's related, but it's not a direct, focus of today's talk. But do you know when that was federalized, when that was made federal?
Yes, right. In 1964, it was right after the assassination. I don't know the exact date, but that's when it was.
And I would imagine that was a pretty bipartisan, unanimous
right.
vote.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then let's see here. There's a couple others, and again, we so appreciate your taking the time to share your experience with us. One correspondent asks if you think part of Oswald's motivation might be the fact that here we are in 2024 and we're talking about him. Do you think there might have been something of a fame seeking, perhaps infamy seeking element that, he's written himself into the history book?
I think he wanted to make history. I think what we know of his flight, and I think he expected that it was likely that he would be caught. But he wanted to get away. It's very clear he wanted to get away. And Dave Bellin believed, and I tend to agree with Bellin, that he was really headed toward Mexico and ultimately toward Cuba, and that he was going to try to take some kind of asylum and claim that he was being falsely accused simply because he was a Marxist who had defected to the Soviet Union. When he was arrested and in custody, he tried to contact the counsel for the Communist Party USA, Communist Party USA, John Apt, because he wanted to hire him as his lawyer. So I think he expected somewhat like the Rosenbergs, and I think some of us who are old enough know who the Rosenbergs were, but he expected that if he was going to go to trial, he would go to trial claiming that he was being falsely accused.
Sure, absolutely. And I think that raises another interesting historical question. We tend to think of this in terms of, I think it's easy to fall into the trap of thinking of the Kennedy assassination in extremely domestic terms. We think about it as an American tragedy, and we think of it through the lens of domestic politics, domestic focus. This was in the context of the Cold War. This was in a period of such heightened tension. Can you speak a little bit, especially if we have folks still on the call who might not have, shall we say, as vivid memories of that period, how this played out on the global stage and how this might have shifted the delicate balance that existed at that point in the Cold War?
Well, this is looking at it from Oswald's perspective. Oswald had become very disillusioned with the Soviet Union. The one thing he had got out of the Soviet Union was a wife, a very attractive, bright woman, who also, life was not happy in the Soviet Union. But he had two other potential models for Marxism. One was what Castro was doing in Cuba, and he wanted very much to go there. But he'd also had some admiration for Mao Zedong in China. So he was a committed Marxist, but not a Soviet communist. However, the issues in the Cold War were between the United States and the Soviet Union. So certainly one of the first reactions upon the president's being shot was a fear that the Soviet Union had somehow set up the assassination of President Kennedy, and that they had used Oswald in some way to their own benefit. And that was the focus of the Warren Commission's primary investigation, that and Cuba. So that's how it fitted into the Cold War.
Sure, absolutely. And then just as we start to wrap up here, if you'll indulge something of a personal question, I know Gerald Ford was one of the members of the commission. And then in his administration, there were 2 attempts on his life. As someone who you would have worked with on the commission, can you talk about what it was like to see those fortunately failed attempts? And did you did you reach out to President Ford at that point? Did you, how was that to live through, with that shared background you both had?
Actually, I had no contact with Gerald Ford. We, despite the fact that we had both gone to the same law school at very different times.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Well, Judge Griffin, you've been so kind to share of your time. We're going to share the recording from today's session on our YouTube channel. We'll put it out in our newsletter. We'll tell folks how they can go out and get a copy of your great new book. And thank you for not only your service on the Warren Commission, but your lifetime of service in our judicial branch. We really appreciate all that you've done and coming to this point in American history.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and good luck and best wishes with all that you are doing there.
Thank you, Judge. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Be well.